One could probably say that the first party to have emerged in what is now Mexico was probably in the 16th century, more or less at the time.
What are you talking about? I thought we were doing parties as in partying.
No, I've got 50 minutes worth of 19th century Mexican politics.
Absolutely not. We're doing partying.
All right, Tavo, we'll do parties, but I will insist on one thing, which is the history of partying in Mexico is so rich. It is worth going back hundreds of years, maybe not to the dawn of time, but just to tell you how important partying is in Mexico. I'd like to start more or less where the idea of Mexico starts to come together in the sort of modern sense of the word, which is the unison of the old world and the new world, because parties in Mexico are so sacred any way you slice it. Fiestas, parties, festivities of religious nature that go on and become a big social gathering are a core of every bit of Mexican culture. You'll be very acquainted with the concept of the Sensontototchtin, the 400 drunken rabbits, the gods of drunkenness in the indigenous world, where they come up and they party every time a bit of booze comes out. And it was so sacred at the time that the legal drinking age in pre-Hispanic Mexico was 52. So that ought to make American listeners worry a bit less about their 21-year-old drinking age.
I do love that it was very sacred, but at the same time, it was described as 400 drunken rabbits.
Yes, absolutely. There's even a mezcal called 400 Rabbits now in honor of that wonderful image of drunken rabbits jumping around in your stomach, having fun. Basically, every time there's a bit of jolliment around alcohol and booze and parties, these drunken rabbits emerge as the gods representative of that. But that doesn't mean that parties stopped when the Spaniards arrived. In fact, parties continued. They just took a different sort of sacred aspect. The sacredness of parties and festivities under Spanish rule was obviously massively fixated around Christianity. But I'd like to focus on something else, which is we all kind of know the Christian baggage of Mexican sort of fiestas patronales. These are the parties that are built around saints, where people come out and they've got fireworks and they come out into the town square, they eat fried foods and they go to the fair. But really, when the Spaniards arrived, they arrived with African peoples, some of them enslaved, some of them free as conquistadores. And there's this wonderful book called Sovereign Joy, Afro-Mexican Kings and Queens from 1539 to 1640 by Miguel Vallejo. And he talks about how Africans were incorporated into this partying in a Christian way in weird and wonderful ways, because ultimately parties are a good way of getting people involved. And there's this weird balance between cultural imposition. You're making people come to parties so that you can convert them into Christianity. But parties are also a good place to rebel. And these African peoples of the early Mexican age were a perfect illustration of that. Basically, they were recruited, Afro-Mexican performers, to dance for colonial elites, including the viceroy, almost as like the eternal other. They're black, and so they'll be acting out the Black Queen of Sheba seducing King Solomon, and they'll show the exoticness of this new world to arriving dignitaries from Spain. So that's sort of the othering from the Spanish, but for the Africans performing this, it was actually a really good place, sure, as the title says it, right, to express sovereign joy, but it's a scene of cultural self-expression and defiance. We see this slightly more clearly further south in Brazil, where they've got capoeira, and they can always just say, oh, I was just dancing, even though they were practicing a martial art. In Mexico, this is centuries before the development of capoeira, and it's the importation of African culture and partying into Mexico for the first time in the Atlantic world, says the author Vallejo. And so parties and festivities are a dance between this balance between cultural imposition and cultural rebellion. And you see this all throughout, right? You've got pastorellas, which are these plays that you act out during Christmas festivities, where you play out the birth of the baby Jesus, and there's always a drunk person, there's always a person who eats too much. It's very much in the atmosphere of partying. There's piñatas, which started out as a representation of the 7 deadly sins that you had to destroy, and then they slowly but surely fold into Mexican culture as a whole. I think there's a third factor at play here, which we'll definitely be exploring later on in this podcast, which is the forces of the market. Piñatas are amazing because they show you this evolution from this very sacred festivity where you're breaking off the 7 deadly sins with a stick into a literal children's party. Today, you go downtown to Mexico City and you'll find piñatas in the shape of emojis and Batman and Superman.
And I think another festivity or celebration that is very core to Mexican tradition and that has also been affected by the market is the Day of the Dead, the Dia de Muertos. Now, Dia de Muertos is not quiet the way we see it in James Bond or in Coco. It's definitely become more prevalent in Mexican culture as a result of that, because a lot of people come in as tourists and they want to see what they saw in the films. But it is there. And it has been there for a very long time. And it's a wonderful example of other things that you mentioned, Alex, because, of course, the Day of the Dead is a blend of Catholic tradition with pre-Hispanic tradition. And I think something additional that we can see in celebrations like the Day of the Dead is that despite a lot of Mexican partying being linked to being very rambunctious and there being a lot of booze and a lot of partying, granted, that's a big part of it, there are also other important characteristics to Mexican celebrations, like the Day of the Dead, which is a beautiful celebration of remembrance of those people who are no longer with us in life, and includes next to no alcohol, and it remains very, very much at the heart of Mexican celebrations.
But to be frank, there is a lot of actual genuine partying and alcohol. Just as a reference, the intro music we use here is an extract from Pelea de Gallos, which is specifically a song about cockfighting in the Fiesta de San Marcos, the Feast of St. Mark's in Aguascalientes, celebrated every year in a massive extravaganza where basically the entire city is closed down for a titanic week-long party.
And granted, there are no more cockfights allowed in the Feria de San Marcos, but the fair was so much fun and remains so much fun, they just couldn't do away with it.
Absolutely. And so I think that's where we keep our definition of parties, right? There's festivities, there's solemn rites, and they blend into actual, genuine, raucous partying. But let's focus in on partying in Mexico, because I think that's what a lot of people think about when they think about Mexico. They think about parties, and there's a really good reason for that. But just before we sneak into the modern age, I'd like to ask you, what do you think happened to those Afro-Mexican traditions that were celebrated during the colonial age?
I don't know. I would imagine that they've survived to some degree in coastal towns, but it's true that one doesn't really see them in Mexico City, for example. At least I don't think so.
Oh, you're absolutely right on everything except for the scale. Afro-Mexican traditions absorbed into Mexican culture so early on, and this is why I compare it to capoeira, I contrast it to capoeira, because capoeira came on later on, massively different history in Brazil. In Mexico, the miscegenation was so early on and so intense that African partying traditions absorbed into Mexican partying traditions, which included the Spaniards, the indigenous peoples, and these Afro-Mexican traditions. So from clothing to food to the dances that we dance today in different parts of Mexico where you wouldn't even expect to see many Afro-Mexican people face to face, they continue to live on through those traditions. Big part of it, of course, is dancing. And I think that's something that everyone understood even at the turn of the 20th century, where Mexico was pretty established. I'd like to bring up another author now who's come and gone when it comes to how popular he is. I think he's in a dip right now because of a bunch of stuff in his life. You can look it up later on, or maybe we'll do a different podcast on him. He's Octavio Paz. He's Mexico's Poetry Nobel Laureate. He won it in 1991. He's incredibly famous and nowadays infamous, but widely known and regarded as one of Mexico's great writers and cultural thinkers. And he's got this wonderful essay, which I think is slightly outdated, but is still wonderful, poetic at least, called The Labyrinth of Solitude. And he dedicates a whole chapter to partying. And I'd like to sort of draw from it slightly, because there's something wonderful about how outdated it is, and also how much it predicts about the future of Mexican partying. So he's written this in the early 20th century, and he still speaks to us today. So just a quick extract. He says, "The art of the party, shunned almost everywhere else, remains intact among us. Our calendar is thoroughly populated with festivities during which the whole country prays, shouts, eats, gets drunk, and kills in honor of the Virgin of Guadalupe or General Zaragoza." Now, there's so much to unpack in that quote, because there he's talking about, of course, the raucousness, but also the sanctity of these festivities, and where you can see the Virgin of Guadalupe compared with the liberal General Zaragoza. We're sort of sandwiched in between two interesting podcasts here, because we've just spoken about how anti-clerical the Mexican liberals of the 19th century were, and very soon, on the 5th of May, or around there, we'll be talking about the Battle of Puebla, where General Zaragoza was the great hero.
Now, Octavio Paz famously wrote this after having spent some time in Paris, being exceptionally lonely in a country which he didn't understand, in a weather, in a climate that he wasn't familiar with. And I think this will sound to listeners a little bit essentialist. You know, you've got the civilized Europeans who don't party, and the uncivilized Mexicans who's still good fun. And that's maybe why Octavio Paz, why the work of Octavio Paz, at least The Labyrinth of Solitude, remains a classic, but one that has lost a lot of popularity in recent years.
Absolutely. This weird prognostication of Mexicans who virtually love murdering each other. This is some white dude from Mexico City telling Mexicans what they are. And even though he is slightly more nuanced than I'm giving away here, there is a lot to be criticized of him. But at the same time, there is a lot of interesting things to unpack in these, we'll call them stereotypical characterizations of the Europeans, the bourgeois Europeans, versus the Mexican debauchery and madness of Mexico. One of them is the fact that he was a weirdly grim predictor of loneliness in modern life that came to invade Mexico more or less when he died, Octavio Paz, in the 1998. The arrival of, we'll call it modernity, but we've discussed this before, the arrival of the Washington Consensus, neoliberalism, brought with it a lot of things, including, I'd say quite tragically, the elimination of loads of wonderful celebrations on the calendar. It started from the liberal age, where you had festivities of a religious nature being taken out, replaced by the civic festivities of El Grito de la Independencia, which is celebrated on the 9th of the 15th of September, Mexican Independence Day, a massive, wonderful party, and other parties like that. But they were slowly withered away in the name of modernity. And today, Mexico has very few days off and very few actively celebrated festivities beyond the local. And I think that's where there's an interesting comparison between modern Mexico, which comes in and does away with parties because they're wasteful and silly, and traditional Mexico, which you can still find in small towns and traditional neighborhoods in Mexico City even, where you get people who annoy their neighbors, who hate the fact that they're always bursting fireworks throughout the night because they're celebrating one saint or another. And that is just charged with racism, classism, and this eternal divide that we've discussed over and over again in Mexico, which is that class-racial divide that divides the traditional parts of Mexico with the modern and modernizing parts of Mexico.
Definitely. And though, as you say, this has to a degree fallen since the appearance of the significant reforms of the 1990s, there's a wonderful example of how, despite those reforms, some of this still exists. And it's something they call San Lunes, Saint Monday. You've just spoken about how in many parts of the country, at a local level, we celebrate all these different saints. There is no Saint Monday. But since there always is a saint or some local celebration that is being celebrated somewhere, it is very common, particularly in construction sites and factories, for people to just not show up on Monday. And it's a joke. You're saying, oh, you're celebrating Saint Monday, right? Because it's such a recurring theme that significant chunks of the working population in rural Mexico just won't show up because they were partying.
And a bunch of people will say, how irresponsible, this is why Mexico is like it is. But no, it takes us all the way back to this colonial dichotomy where partying is a form of resistance, laziness, and having a good time in spite of what your boss wants you to do is a wonderful form of rebellion. And we see that throughout the Mexican civic calendar. You've got Guadalupe Reyes, or as we call it, Guadalupe Tavo, because this goes from the Virgin of Guadalupe's birthday, as they call it here, on the 12th of December. And it's basically just a long period of debauchery and fun times until Epiphany, the Dia de los Reyes, on the 6th of January. So it just goes all the way through Christmas, and it concludes actually on the 7th of January, which is Octavio Figueroa's birthday.
The most important celebration of the year, that is.
Absolutely. And my favorite saint as well. And so we can unpack the racial and the class divides of Mexican partying to death. But ultimately, I think we all kind of agree with the fact that working class people have more fun than the rich because of the snobbery, because of, like the fact that modernism sterilizes everything. It sort of, you don't have to go to a small Mexican town to see what you can see in the film Titanic when Rose goes down with Jack to the underbelly of the Titanic with the working class Irish and Scandinavians and Eastern Europeans dancing a jig and having far more fun than the Americans and the British up on the deck.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. But I will play a little bit of devil's advocate here. And
Go on.
It's great to see all of these beautiful celebrations and to see them as a form of resistance and of affirmation of oneself in face of the forces of the market. That's true. But there's also a more grim perspective. And I'm not saying it's the only perspective, but there is a grim side to this. And I don't want to be a negative Nancy, but it must be said that, as we've spoken about before, Mexico is a very unequal country. It is a country with a lot of poverty. And it's not just people who are poor, it is people who are poor and live a very difficult life, oftentimes. And this sort of debauchery that goes on, sometimes for the span of a whole week, entire weekends, is in many ways a way to numb out the difficulties of this existence, in great part imposed by market conditions.
You're absolutely right, Tavo. I think this is something I was going to bring up later on if we didn't mention it, but I'm glad you did, because there is an issue with partying as escapism, right? All the poverty, all the inequality, all the violence that we see in Mexico can, to some extent, be connected with how much alcoholism we see across Mexico linked to parties, and how Mexico has basically acquired this problem with an addiction to alcohol because of its historical attachment to parties. 20 million people in Mexico, as of recent statistics, face problems with alcohol consumption. That's 15% of the entire country's population. So I think that's definitely something to be reckoned with. That's a big issue the Mexican government is dealing with. We wrote in the Mexico Political Economist a few weeks ago about why Mexico doesn't have a fentanyl crisis, but it does have issues with other drugs. And alcohol is a big, big issue in Mexican society. And partying as escapism isn't limited just to Mexicans. This is something I think that will basically end up answering the question of why Mexicans are so good at partying, as opposed to other podcasts that we've done. We actually do have an answer for this one. And it's parties as escapism in Mexico work, as rebellion, as a historical remittance from a diverse past. But actually, it's also because of Americans, funnily enough. Mexico is good at partying because it lives next door to this highly puritanical and incredibly wealthy megastate. Octavio Paz actually mentions this in his book. He talks about how Anglo-Saxons, when he's mentioning the British and the Americans, how they deal differently with parties. He sees them as more isolated. He actually talks about the cocktail party and the weekend being itemized spaces where you're limited with your nuclear family or on your own to do social stuff, but not ever in this explosive way that happens in Mexico. But Americans definitely want this. Anyone who's been near Cancun or seen a photo from Cancun in spring break knows this perfectly. But what's interesting is, how is it that they're so Puritan and at the same time they're so desperate to get out into a space for raucousness? And there's a long history to this, but the clearest starting point, no doubt, is in Tijuana between the years of 1920 and 1933, which I'm sure you know what that was, Tavo.
I guess you're referring there to the Prohibition in the United States.
That's right, the prohibition of alcohol. It's basically a terrible decade where no one who wasn't rich was able to drink anything above board. And so people in California, and mostly, headed just south of the border to have a quick tipple. And Tijuana became this nightlife mecca for Americans that would later on expand to the rest of Mexico, starting in Tijuana during Prohibition, but then branching out well after Prohibition, because escapism continued to be a part of the American dream, right? They've already colonized the country from coast to coast. There was nowhere left to go but south. And so that's why you get Hollywood South in the 1950s in the city of Acapulco, where it was basically a party hub for the Hollywood elite, where you got Sinatra, Elizabeth Taylor, John Wayne, Orson Welles. Now, people went there, some would say, because of the permissiveness of Mexico. Others would say because of the tolerance, right? Permissiveness, because, of course, you were able to do a lot more far away from the peering eyes of your peers in California, but also tolerance, because this is the middle of the Cold War and people could speak freely and think freely in a place that McCarthyism simply didn't allow them to do it in. And so you've got this golden age of Acapulco. And
I would add also, there's an important part of something that continues to be very relevant in Mexico is the sort of service culture that exists. And that has negative sides to it, but it has some amazing sides to it as well. Mexico is a place where you can show up, go to the staff of a particular restaurant and, tell them that you have this idea for a celebration for your birthday, and they will all play ball. They will do the most outrageous things, so long as you pay whatever you have to pay, and it's never too much. They are down to party, and everyone joins in. And I think it's the kind of culture where you want to have a place like Acapulco, which was very much like the Saint-Tropez of back then for Americans.
And you can see it in the way the dynamic between these rich, often, if not exclusively, white Americans, in fact, very male Americans, coming down from America to free themselves of the shackles of the puritanical society, and coming across relatively poorer, working-class Mexicans at their beck and call. And we see this repeating itself over and over again. Even after Acapulco stopped being famous for its parties and became more famous, sadly, for its war on drugs, the party spread to many other parts of Mexico, most famously Cancun. Now, I will ask every single reader to read the piece in the Mexico Political Economist called Cancun, the Mexican Government's Frankenstein, because that will give you more or less of an idea of where I'm going next, which is partying became an industry in Mexico, not only for people who owned bars, nightclubs, and hotels on beach resorts, but for the Mexican government itself.
Somewhere in the 1970s, Luis Echeverria, about whom we've spoken in the past, decided that he needed to capitalize on that neighbor to the north and their wanton need for partying. And we already had Acapulco, but he said, we've got a lot of very nice beaches, and beaches in Mexico are particularly nice. So he set out to develop a bunch of different resorts, Ixtapas, Guatanejo, Huatulco, both on the Pacific coast south of Acapulco. But then he also develops Cancun. Now, when Cancun is developed, it isn't an obvious place to develop anything. It's between marshes and mangrove forests. There's a lagoon on one side infested with crocodiles, and recurring hurricanes on the other side. But somehow he turns it into this absolutely wonderful location. That is, until it got a little bit out of hand.
Absolutely. And the article goes into that in depth, right? Where the state abdicates its responsibility for developing somewhere and hands it over to a completely private to completely private efforts, which in themselves, though not bad, when completely left to be unregulated, leaves you with Cancun today, which is a place heaving with people with very few essential pieces of infrastructure, like a functioning drainage system and in the working class parts of the city.
Actually, I remember once being, not in Cancun per se, but very close. And it was raining quite a bit, and I was in a taxi, and the water level was rising on the street. And I said, "Oh, it must be that the sewages are clogged." And the driver said, "No, the problem is we don't have sewage."
Yeah. So today, where is Cancun? I mean, there's so many other places in Mexico to visit, but Cancun is still where 40% of US arrivals come when they arrive in Mexico. At 45 million foreign visitors in 2023, Mexico made up close to 40% of Latin America's total tourist numbers. So that's enormous anyway. And of those, 20 million international tourists went to Cancun, which is on top of the 12 million domestic tourists that went alongside the foreigners to this incredibly famous beach resort. So everyone is always using the term, oh, it's the next Cancun, as a negative term, but it is a massive driver of development in that part of the country.
One statistic that particularly shows that is back in the early 2000s, the Louis Vuitton, the French luxury brand, that sold the most in the entire world was not in Paris, was not in New York, was not in the Middle East. It was in Cancun. Cancun attracts so much tourism and a large chunk of it with so much wealth that it drives much of the Mexican economy.
And it's all thanks to parties. It's the partying. It's, of course, the pristine beaches. But there's other places in Mexico where people there's other places in Mexico where people gather simply because it's just a really good place to have a really good time. And so that's why Mexicans are good at partying, because of their history, because of their problematic relationship with alcohol, and because of Americans' problematic relationship with alcohol. It's all a very convoluted story, but here's to that, Tavo, because without that sort of convoluted story, we wouldn't be here talking about all this wonderful cultural baggage and treasure that Mexico has to offer.
Thanks be to the 400 rabbits. I'm Tavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez Ormrod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we're taking you through Mexico's history, economics, and politics.
And why you, wherever you are in the world, are deeply affected by it every single day.
Subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist to support us. Bye for now.